So over the last 22 or so years that I've been in the ERP and digital transformation consulting industry, I've had the good fortune of being involved in a number of different transformation in a variety of industries, a variety of technologies that were deployed, a variety of personalities that I've been involved with. And there are three in particular that stand out as key milestones or key learnings and case studies that I have experienced over the last 20 years, and wanted to talk today about three of those lessons. So the first one is a company that was actually the very first client of the last company that I started, the last consulting company that I had created. And it was a mid-size consumer services type of organization based in Denver, where the company was based as well. And this company was embarking on a software selection and implementation. And this was the first project that our team had helped select and implement the software for. And a couple of things that really stood out to me about this particular client at the time was, first of all, the executive sponsor was a guy named John that is still a good personal friend of mine to this day. And he was the chief operating officer, or the equivalent of the chief operating officer, and didn't know a lot about technology, was not a CIO techie type guy at all, but he knew the business really well, he knew the operations inside and out, and he just came at challenges and problems from a business first perspective rather than a technology first perspective. And this business first perspective was very critical when it came time to make tough decisions around, are we going to customize? How do we want our business processes to look? What are we going to roll out technology-wise, and when and how? How are we going to involve key people in the process? All of these sorts of things came a little bit more naturally to this particular sponsor because of his operations first type of mentality. And up until this point, most of my experience as a consultant had been working with CIO types, people that came up in the technology world. So it was really different and refreshing at the same time to see someone that came at it from a business perspective. But not only did I like working with that type of personality a little bit better than some of the more technology types at the time, it was more about how easy it was or how effective it was for him to make decisions and to lead the project and to provide direction and vision. So that was one of the big lessons I had from that project, was the fact that having a business-oriented executive sponsor and someone that was really helping guide and set the vision and approach for the project can actually help tremendously. The other component of this project that was very eye-opening for me was that everything was a business-first perspective. So every decision that was made was around, how does this support the business? If it doesn't support the business or improve the business, then we're not doing it. So we didn't deploy technology for technology's sake. There were times where we left technology off the table and chose to stick to manual processes or Excel spreadsheets in some cases, because those processes were so finely tuned and so efficient and they worked. So we weren't about to break those in the name of just putting in new technology. And so that was one of the early lessons that really formulated and influenced how I thought about digital transformations from that point on. Another example of how the business-first approach and mentality really drove the success of this project was that they had a heavy field service component of their business that the ERP system they had deployed didn't really support. And so there was a need to create some custom technology using mobile devices, and this was back in 2005, 2006. So this was before mobile was as common as it is today. And they weren't afraid of customization. The client was not afraid to take a gamble and say, we're going to invest in customizing the software because it's that critical to our business and our secret sauce that we are going to do it. And they were very selective and strategic about when and where they invested dollars and time in customization, but they would go ahead and do that in the name of the business where it made sense. And so those are a couple of the lessons that I had from this particular client. It was a client that we worked with for about 1.5 years from the selection through the implementation. And like I said, I still remain close friends with the executive sponsor to this day, but it was one of the most memorable projects that I've been involved with so far. Another case study of a really memorable ERP implementation, and a very influential implementation in my upbringing in the consulting world, was a mid-size global manufacturer of industrial products. They made gauges and sensors for oil field services and pipelines, and they would create the instrumentation that would measure pressure and temperature of oil and other liquids that would be going through pipelines. And they were implementing a Tier 2 manufacturing ERP system. We actually helped them select that software during the evaluation phase, and we ultimately ended up implementing the entire solution for them in conjunction with the software vendor. In this case, we had an executive sponsor that was more of the traditional CIO technology type, but he had a very deep business understanding. So it was a very strong combination of understanding technology and understanding what technology could do for the business, but also having a very strong understanding of why the business operates the way it does, understanding what the pros and cons and weaknesses of the current operating model were. So he had a good way of deciphering between getting stuck in the past just because it's the way we've always done it versus having the vision to see how technology and process improvements could help improve the organization going forward. In addition to the CIO, who was a very strong internal project manager, we also had the CEO of the company that was very actively involved in the project as the executive sponsor. He was actively involved in making key business decisions around process improvements and things that needed to be decided upon by the executives versus just delegating it to the project team. So he was very helpful and instrumental in setting the vision for the project and being involved and rolling up his sleeves in helping define what the business needed to look like post-implementation. His strong leadership was also a key reason why the company was able to stick to a pretty aggressive implementation timeline that probably wouldn't have worked for a lot of organizations. He was able to mobilize the troops and really keep everyone focused on keeping the project going, making key decisions quickly where they needed to be made, and helping transition people from the current state to the future state. He really helped set the tone and the vision for what he wanted the organization to look like. So that was another critical leadership quality that this particular CEO had. But probably the biggest lesson that I had from this project was the one thing that didn't go well. In this case, we had an aggressive timeline. We started to run into some trouble with some of the customization toward the end of testing. And what ended up happening is there were a couple delays to the project as a result of testing issues resulting from the customization that the client wanted. Now, these were customizations that were, in my opinion, warranted. They made sense. They were what was needed to support the business and address the limitations of the software that was being implemented. And it did create problems, though, that even though they were warranted, it created some delays as the project went on. And I think there were 2 delays leading up to the go-live, and there was about 30 days more work still remaining that we felt was needed to make the go-live be lower risk. And so what we had suggested to this particular client is let's push another 30 days. It was going to cost a fairly nominal amount of, I think it was like $75,000 or $100,000 additional to increase the duration by another 30 days. And then we felt like that would mitigate the risk that we were running into during the testing. But what this client said was, in the spirit of his aggressive timeline and setting the clear vision, is that he didn't want to wait any longer. He wanted to go live and work through the problems after go live, but he was tired of spending the time and money, and he didn't want to have another delay on his watch. So we advised him not to do that. He chose to, so we followed the marching orders and moved forward with the implementation, and the go live didn't go well. They were unable to ship product for several weeks. When all was said and done, they had lost several $1 million of orders. They weren't just delayed or deferred or stuck in a backlog. They were actually lost orders because the customers couldn't wait for as long as it was going to take them to ship the product because of some of the other issues that were caused and that weren't addressed by the go live. So that was one of the biggest lessons and one of the hardest projects that I was involved with so far at that point in my career. And I still, to this day, will refer to that story as the Hail Mary go live. And I always advise clients not to take the Hail Mary go live approach. You're never going to be 100% ready. You're never going to mitigate risks 100%. But there's a certain fine line that you cross between knowing that you're never going to be fully ready versus taking risks that you don't need to be taking. So really taking an agnostic view, an objective view of how and when it makes sense to go live, is really important to make sure you've mitigated those risks. The next case study that's been the most memorable for me in my career so far is a client that I've been working with now, our team and I have been working with now for about 5 or 6 years, and we're still working with them as we speak. And they're a very large organization. They're one of the biggest steel companies in the world, going through a massive ERP and digital transformation project. And this company is a fascinating company to me. They're a well-known company that many of you have probably heard of. And one of the most interesting things that I like about this company is, they had problems with their ERP implementation early on, largely because they were experiencing a lot of resistance to change, and they were getting stuck in the mud with making decisions around what the software should look like and how processes should look. And what they did was they created a new role called the Chief Digital Officer role. And they moved a guy into that role that had been at the company for his entire career, I believe it was, or at least most of his career, for 30+ years. And he knew the business really well. He was very well respected in the organization, but didn't know really anything about technology or ERP projects. But they put him in this role of Chief Digital Officer. And the minute they put him in that role, things started to change. Decisions became faster and quicker. The business was more aligned with the IT and ERP project. And there was just a certain amount of credibility that you started to see with the project once the client put that Chief Digital Officer in place. The other thing I really like about this client is that they don't fall victim to sales spin or buzzwords and that sort of thing. In fact, they reject that sort of outside spin or bias, and they do what's right for their business. They'll implement technology where it makes sense, and where it doesn't make sense, regardless of what other companies are doing or what the rest of the industry is doing, they'll do what makes sense for them. And one of the biggest examples that we saw about midway through this transformation is they were implementing one of the big ERP vendors' legacy on-premise systems. And when it came time to move into the next phase of the project, there was a decision to be made of whether we start going to the cloud, because that was the new flagship product from that vendor, or do we stick with on-premise? And the decision was made to go to the cloud. And as the client got through the blueprint phase and some of the requirements gathering for that next big wave of the project, they found that the cloud version of the software wasn't going to meet their needs, and they went back to the on-premise model. Now, a lot of people in the industry would say, well, that sounds like they're resisting change, or they're just deferring the inevitable, which is everyone's going to be in the cloud. But they don't really care what everyone else is doing, or what vendors want them to do, or what industry analysts or consultants tell them they should do. They do what's right for their business, and I find that very fascinating. And I think it's very effective in their case, because they are letting the dog wag the tail rather than the tail wag the dog, and not letting technology over-influence how their business is run. Another thing I really like about this client and this project is that they are using one of the big system integrators. And the system integrator had kind of morphed into a huge team with questionable transparency and questionable accountability on the project, and a very high run rate in terms of monthly spend on this particular system integrator. And what they found is they weren't getting the value they had wanted out of the system integrator, and they weren't able to manage the system integrator the way they had wanted to. So what they did is they came in and rationalized the team that they had, and actually significantly downsized the system integrator team, and started to take a more aggressive and active role in managing those resources and making sure they were involved in the decision making and in terms of how the project was staffed and how those outside consultants were being staffed. And that's something that's very important. We don't see a lot of companies do, but it's highly effective if you can find the wherewithal to do that, to manage your system integrator. One of the other things they did too is to bring in a third-party agnostic consultant to help provide the overall program management, to manage the system integrator and other resources, third-party and internal, that were required for the project. The other interesting thing about this client is that they have deployed a best-of-breed model. They haven't doubled down and gone all in on one ERP vendor. They use a lot of the leading ERP systems in the marketplace for different parts of their business that they've acquired from other organizations, or that have grown organically into new markets. And again, in the spirit of making sure the tail doesn't wag the dog, they make sure that the business needs come first, front and center, and technology is meant to simply enable some of those processes. Another example of how they use best of breed to their advantage is they've said, we're going to run as a decentralized organization with multiple ERP systems, but we're going to tie it all together with a common business intelligence platform across the globe. And that's a somewhat unique model that not a lot of organizations will go down, especially when they're already using some of the big ERP systems. And it's been highly effective for them so far. And so far, this particular transformation, even though it has had its challenges, has been one of the most successful that I've been involved with. So those are three projects that have probably had the biggest influence on me as a consultant, ones that I enjoyed the most, ones I learned the most from. And some of the biggest takeaways and themes that I saw in all three of these cases were, one, people that know the business and having a business-oriented approach to the leadership on the project, as well as the focus and decision-making on the project. I find that these three case studies are good examples of what can happen and how successful you can be when you have business-focused and business-minded people leading and setting the direction for the project. The second big takeaway and lesson here is that all three of these projects really viewed these transformations as their project. They viewed themselves as being in control. They didn't completely defer or outsource the project to any third party like a lot of companies do. They took complete control, and when they felt like they were losing control in all these cases, they clamped down and took control and made the decisions they needed to make. Whether the system integrators or the software vendors or outside consultants liked those decisions or not didn't really matter, because it's their business and they made those decisions based on what they thought was best for their business. So these are some of the lessons that I've found from these three case studies. I've also included a link below that's 20 lessons from 1,000+ ERP implementations. That's a white paper I wrote a few months ago that outlines the 20 things that I've learned and that I found to be the most successful in all of the implementations I've been involved with over the years. So I encourage you to download that white paper for more content like this. I hope you found this information useful and look forward to chatting with you soon.